all our emails. It can autocorrect our text. Like, it's great. It can like write technical reports, like all kinds of stuff. Like it's a really transformative technology in many ways. But I think if it's used for like high risk, which I would say, which is like in the criminal justice system, how long people should be sentenced to jail. I think hiring is also high risk because it matters if I have a job, right? And like it matters if I can provide for my family. And a lot of us also have a lot of happiness and fulfillment in their jobs. So we all strive to have at least somewhat fulfilling jobs for most people. So if I apply and I'm not the most qualified candidate, I'd be upset. But if I find out that I was rejected because I had the word softball on my resume, I would be absolutely livid. That's not fair.
Hi, I'm Denise Chaffin, and I am your podcast host for Talking TA. And today I have with me, I am so excited. I have with me Hilke Schellmann, who is the author. Hilke is the author of the book called The Algorithm. And I'm going to let Hilke go ahead and introduce herself. Give us a little bit about your background, Hilke, and what inspired you to write this book.
What a crazy ride it's been. Yeah, so my name is Hilke Schellmann. I'm an investigative reporter, and I'm also a journalism professor at New York University. And I mean, I've done a lot of work in journalism, but I've done like student loan investigations. I've done an alleged gang rape in Pakistan that I followed for years. I made a documentary out of it that went to Frontline. I worked for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and I've usually done video and podcast. And I think the AI topic kind of found me in a way. In November 2017, I was at a conference with consumer lawyers in Washington, D.C., had nothing to do with AI or hiring or anything. But I needed a ride to the train station to catch a train back to New York. So, as many people do, I called myself a Lyft, like a ride share, got in the back seat and asked the driver how he was doing. And he told me, I've had a weird day. And I was like, really? How so? And he's like, I was interviewed by a robot. And I was like, interviewed by a robot? He was like, yeah, I had a job interview for a baggage handler position at a local airport. And I got a call from a robot today. And I was like, what? So we talked briefly about it. He got like the robot asked him 3 questions. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't a quote unquote robot. It was pre recorded voice asking him these questions. Never heard of it. Made a note, and then I started going to some conferences, and like people talked about this, and like when it came up again and again that we use AI for this, for that in the workplace. And I went to PsyOp and HR Tech, and there were so many people there, so much technology, and I was like, "Where are the journalists?" And I looked in papers. This is like 2017, 2018. I was like, "We're not really reporting on this. We need to report on this." And that's how the journey started with like a video for the Wall Street Journal, and then I encountered more technology, more things, and I just the idea of like how we quantify human being and score them is like so interesting and fascinating that I'm still working on it. I mean, I did write the book, but I'm still working on the topic, and it's not letting me go.
Like, well, and it won't. It won't. You're in. You're in to stay. Well, the thing is you're entering so many different spaces, and now you're in our space, talent acquisition, and so and I think this is gonna be an important podcast as the others you've done with people in our space, because I know a couple other people that you've spoken with, because we need right now, especially with so much software that's being sold. We have attended a few conferences this year where they're just selling massive amounts of software with AI on the back end, just
Yeah, and I get it. I talk to all the companies, right? And they tell me they get millions of applications. Like, folks are overwhelmed by the amount of resumes and applications they get, especially now when so many job seekers use ChatGPT, right? It makes their lives easier and other LLMs to like generate cover letters or help them with their resumes and even auto applications, right? Like it's like I get that on the other side, it's like pretty overwhelming.
it really is. I mean, I can't even get over it. It's more so than we've ever seen. I remember when the job boards first came out, and we thought that was a big deal, right? And then pretty soon you had all these applicant tracking systems, and so it has been kind of culminating over the years. Now we've got AI.
Yeah, building up a little bit and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in your book, in your prologue, you mentioned that 90% of business leaders have said that their AI tools have rejected qualified candidates. It so caught my attention.
Yeah.
And the book covers this fact in a lot of detail. I mean, it's huge detail. I was just I was a page turning. So let's dive into that some because I've kind of got like an outline here.
Starting with job seekers, obviously, I talk to a ton of them, and they often don't even know that AI is being used in them, frankly, right? They send their application in and they have no idea what happens with it. They just hoping and hoping that they will hear from someone. But what is interesting, and some of them have like, after sending hundreds of applications, they do feel like, wait, is there like some technology involved that like automatically rejects me or something? Or like, what is going on here? So people have like maybe an inclination. So what is interesting, as I uncovered some problems within the industry, I always felt like, but people must know that this isn't like what the vendors sell. Is like they find the most qualified candidate without bias, democratize everything is so efficient that it's like I haven't really found much evidence that these tools pick the most qualified candidates. And I was like, surely people who use the software and C-suite leaders know this, but we never knew until Joe Fuller at Harvard, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, did a survey of over 2,000 C-suite leadership folks, and in the survey they asked like if you use an AI tool, over 90%, or I think 89 to 90% of the leaders said that they know that the tool rejects qualified candidates. So we all know that these tools aren't working as well as they're being promised to work. So I think that's kind of interesting, and it begs sort of the question, why are we still using them if we know that some of them really don't work well? Because I would assume as a TA, you want like the tool to pick the most qualified people, make life more efficient, and don't discriminate. But if they don't really work well and reject qualified people, should we still use it? I think it does beg the question, right? So, yeah, I was, like, astonished when I saw that. It's in a report that he did called Hidden Workers, about workers who often don't get called back, and that was part of it, the survey, and I was like, "Wow, this is interesting." People might not get that reading the book, but I'm actually pretty neutral about technology. I think technology is technology. We can use it in this way or in that way. And I don't think it's either a doomsday clock nor is it going to save humanity, right? Like it's a technology that we can use. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is like when we use technology to find maybe folks inside a company that maybe deserve praise or deserve a promotion, but haven't really been put forward by the traditional channels of like maybe leaders sitting together and sort of thinking who should we promote, who should be in leadership. And we all know that humans in hiring and in any kind of way interact with people, we have biases, right? And so we often underestimate women and people of color, people with disabilities. I mean, we see that I think to a certain extent in the job numbers, right? And looking at like who is in leadership position. Well, fewer people of color, fewer women, fewer people with disabilities, probably partially at least due to not getting a chance and being underestimated. We know about unconscious bias and that not only affects hiring, but it also affects promotion decisions. So the idea is like, can we use AI to help us here? Inside companies, find hidden gems, people who haven't been maybe brought to the forefront. So we see AI being used of that. And what I think we is now call people analytics. There's always kind of different words. So it's kind of interesting that like companies can use that, especially if they, for example, lack a particular skill. So we often a lot of I think companies are looking to find more machine learning engineers. So I think some of these tools can help you also to understand who are the people that are not quite there yet with that skill, but you could upskill, right? Like, here's a list of people who were this close, who have like 90% of the qualifications. Here are people who have like done all the upskilling. Maybe they are potentially more agile. Maybe you can use those. So I think it could potentially be helpful. I think it'd be great to have longitudinal studies to look at this, like how helpful is it and who do we forget? And I wish companies would do that, but I think there's some interesting promise there. I think other parts of the flight risk predictors, I'm a little bit dubious about. Like, can you really predict how humans are gonna who is gonna leave in the next 12 months or is likely to leave, right? Like who's gonna that's flight risk. And the idea is that I think for managers it could be interesting to know that because if you are a particular high performing employee, they might want to give you incentives to stay, right? Maybe not tell you like, oh, you've been on a flight risk prediction, we're gonna give you a raise, but maybe sort of be very generous to you and praise you and give you a raise. And I guess when I talked to other people analytics folks, they said, well, and if it's an underperforming employee, a company might just sit that one out and be like, well, if they leave anyways, good for us, good for them. Maybe they find something more suitable. But I was like, how good is this? And is there any hidden discrimination or bias in here? And so it turns out it's kind of like risk prediction in like cancer or something like that. A doctor can tell you, like in stage 3 cancer, you have this kind of prediction based on your symptoms, maybe on your age. 70% of people survive or go into remission or something like that. But we never fully know if it's you. And I think that's sort of the same problem with flight risk prediction. Yes, we can look at past data to sort of predict, well, people in general who haven't got a promotion, haven't gotten a raise the last few years, they're probably most likely to leave because they're sad or they're stagnating at their job. Is Hilke gonna leave? I don't know. And in fact, the people I talk to who work in people analytics said, like, yeah, we can like generally predict this for a team or like in general, but it's never 100% clear for the individual because anything can happen to an individual, right? Like my mom could get sick and I want to take care of her. My kid could get sick. I mean, any kind of things. I have a new partner. I want to move, or like some things that have nothing to do with the job. So it's just really difficult. And the question is then, if it's so difficult to predict the future of humans, why are we doing it? Because I think it could be really usually companies have very limited resources, right? Not everyone gets a raise. So if the system points you out as somebody getting a raise, probably somebody else doesn't get one. Well, is that fair? And some predictive behavior that may or may never happen? Like they're real questions that some of this software poses. And I do wonder about the utility of some of these applications.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, and let's go back to, I mean, because I really wanna talk about the resume screeners and the biases there. Because when you talk about some of these analytic tools, I mean, what you were just referring to just now, I know that analytic tools that are predicting, I guess, high performers versus low performers, I think they're calling those now performance measurement or performance tools or something like that. But, I mean, even way before then, though, as we're hiring people, the resume screeners
Yes.
and the online social media stalking and the biases there. Let's dive into that.
So, I mean, I think resume parsers or screeners are probably the most ubiquitous, right? Like we see them almost everywhere, right? Like every job platform has them, of course, because if I'm a recruiter and I maybe use LinkedIn or something and I have an ad there, I don't want like all applicants just coming into a Google Drive, 1,000 of them, right? Like I would like them to be ranked to certain criteria, right? I don't want to call all 1,000 or look at all 1,000 resumes. I want to look at the 20 best ones, right? As we all want. So, like most companies use AI for that, and most large Fortune 500 companies also use AI somewhere in the hiring funnel. And you talked about that, like we used to have applicant tracking systems, which I think back in the day were sort of glorified spreadsheets where you could check where somebody in the funnel of hiring, where they're rejected, next round, here are the notes on them. But now most of those applicant tracking systems also have AI built in. I'm not sure exactly what companies turn on or off, right? Like that we are not privy to that information, but we know it's widely used. And it makes sense, right? Because a lot of companies get millions of applications, so you need something to go through there. And what I've found when I talk to employment lawyers mm, who come in when a vendor and an employer start talking, maybe trying to use the technology, some employers bring in outside lawyers to do their due diligence, and they get to look into what we often call as a black box in AI, right? Because it's not really clear how the decisions are being made. So when I talk to some who actually like kind of investigate, okay, what does this tool actually look at when it analyzes maybe resumes from people who are currently successful in the role that a company wants AI to analyze those resumes to understand, okay, who's going to be successful here outside of like maybe the 3 skills that we have identified for the job? Like, what is the magic sauce of our people? And with those employment lawyers found out that the tool does a statistical analysis, but it's not a conscious thinker. So in one instance, it had predicted that the word Thomas is a predictor of success. So what? we hypothesize is that probably in the pile of resumes that this tool was trained with, there were maybe a bunch of Thomases. So the tool did what it does best. It does a statistical analysis, and Thomas was a predictor. So of course, everyone who works in TA or in hiring knows that like if first names don't mean anything. Obviously, it doesn't qualify you for anything. But you sort of see what happens when we don't check AI necessarily. It does a quantitative analysis. Great, finds out there are a lot of Thomases, and that's not predictive. In fact, you might push into discrimination with that one. Or in another case, it found that locations Syria and Canada are predictive of success. So that's obviously another problem because you might discriminate based on national origin, right? If a tool prefers those people. In another instance, it found African American as a predictor. That could be racial discrimination. In another instance, there were hobbies. Hobbies came up again and again with different employment lawyers. One tool like preferred people with football who'd put football down. Another tool gave people who had the word baseball on their resume more points and the word softball on their resume fewer points. That sounds like gender discrimination because traditionally women play softball and men play baseball or like baseball. And I think like the hypothesis, I wasn't at the table, but the hypothesis is that maybe this was a tech company that had a gender disparity, which we see in a lot of them traditionally, and fed all these resumes into the tool. And yeah, probably the tool did learn that like people here who have the word softball on their resume are less successful than the people who have baseball on their resume.
Okay, so I have a question. So, how long does it take these companies to find these disparities and to realize that their system is kicking out or is making these
I hypothesized that this is what happened, that they had maybe more men in the job and used those resumes, and that's how the tool learned over time that, like, people with baseball in their resume are more successful than softball, because you do wonder, like, how does it come together?
yeah, but how long is it taking these companies to find this out?
So it takes the companies until they look into it. So if they never look into it, they will never find it. So in this case, like, they brought these lawyers in early when they did their due diligence and checked it, but not all companies do. In fact, a lot of companies, what I heard from CHROs and others, they say like, well, this Fortune 500 companies use it, so they must have checked it, so let's just use it. Because it costs money to check these tools, right? Like, and you wanna believe the the vendors and you hope it works, but we now know that like, if you use data, that often the biases that we have in the real world, especially in the workplace, right? We have data riddled with bias in hiring. We already talked about this, like human bias in there. We have this for performance reviews, right? We know this from like large scale research that like performance analysis and performance reviews are biased, that like women get harsher performance reviews even if they do the same job as men. So is with people of color. If you use that, you probably replicate the bias that's already built in, and the same is happening with these resume screeners. And the problem is if we use deep neural networks in AI, which you don't have to know what that means, but it means we have training data, we know the results, but we don't actually know exactly what the computer predicts upon. And a lot of vendors don't look at that. So the vendors themselves who built the software don't necessarily know what the software predicts upon. The companies that build the software don't necessarily know what the tool predicts upon. They just see the ranking. That's what they want. And job seekers don't know anything. So it's pretty unfortunate. I wish people would make the companies open the black box much more often and take a look at it.
So this leads me to another question then. So you were talking earlier about the attorneys that come in and try to evaluate these systems before the companies buy them, right? So are the lawyers then are they going to have to upskill themselves then to know what to look for when they are evaluating these systems before the companies purchase them?
Oh yeah, there's only a few lawyers. Like there's like a couple of law firms that now have like specific AI employment lawyers, like who actually know how to look at it, who know how to read a technical report and sort of like pick apart validation studies and look exactly at this, and also like know what to demand from the vendor, right? Because companies usually buy the technology because they want to have a more efficient workflow, right? They don't necessarily want to buy a tool for a lot of money that is supposed to work, and then they have to bring in outside people for long term to monitor these systems. No, they just want it to work and they assume it works. So there isn't a whole lot of due diligence. And the problem is like when the employment lawyers come in, they often find something. Like one person found a problem in in all the 5 tools he looked at. Another one found it, and he said in about a quarter of tools he found a big problem that he then counseled the companies to not use it. So it's not like 1 in 2,000. It seems like it's like much more prevalent than we wish it is. But
What were those are you at liberty to say what those problems were that they found?
yeah, exactly those problems in resume screeners. I have a whole other list, like somebody also found church as a predictor, like all kinds of keywords that have come up. There's like a long list of in resume screeners, and the other stuff is like the effective computing and all the other things that are also problematic. But I talked to employment lawyers who looked at the video games that some companies ask people to play, and they were like, yeah, we looked at it and we did a pilot study and it just kept discriminating against women. We couldn't get it out of the system. Like we asked the company to redo the model and it kept doing it. And I was like, oh wow. And they're like, yeah, we asked this company, obviously told them to not use the vendor. And I was like, oh, what happened to the vendor? They're like, oh yeah, they used to be a startup. They're now a really big company. And I was like, did they change their games? They're like, we don't know. So I think that is, like, really what concerns me. We have sort of there's obviously a whisper network that some people talk and, like, say, like, "We tested it, it didn't work," so that's good. But I think the problem is obviously vendors. There's something, clear that maybe shows that the tool doesn't work as well as advertised. They don't necessarily wanna talk about this. I sort of get it. But employers who use the technology often don't wanna talk about it either because 'cause they're afraid of class action lawsuits, right? Because if they say, "Hey, we used a tool that discriminated against everyone with the word softball on their resume," and they got hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of people who were channeled through the tool, they might have a massive class action lawsuit at their hands, right? So I think they're afraid too. So nobody's ever the wiser and publicizes this knowledge that is like sort of floating around behind closed doors that I think like, no, but we need to put pressure on these companies to build better tools. Like I'm not against using tools in hiring. I do think that it's like overwhelming for a lot of recruiters and TAs, but like we need to find the good tools and not keep using the bad ones. And I've also had now a lot of leaders like tell me like, oh yeah, we use that tool, we use that gaming company, and after a few years, we were like, I don't think it's working. We had exactly the same questions and problems that you have, and we quietly stopped using it. And I was like, I mean, I'm glad you stopped using it, but like, can't you like tell the world what you found? Because I think that is like really important knowledge. But that doesn't happen because everyone is very afraid of lawsuits, and I wish we could change that.
Now, what about the gaming? So, and you mentioned that in your book, the games that I guess are like AI tests, right? And they're games that are literally missing the boat. Who's using those games and what are they using them for?
Yeah. So we see these games often, especially for young talent, programs that a lot of larger companies have where they bring in like folks who have just graduated college or graduate degree and they go for like maybe 2 years, different parts of the company. And I get it. A lot of TA folks say like they kind of all look the same. Like they have wonderful degrees but they don't have a whole lot of work history, right? Like how am I supposed to know if this person is better than the other? So these are kinds of tools that are supposed to find more out about like your capabilities, maybe your personality, so one game I played was supposed to find out I was supposed to pump up balloons and then collect the money, and I guess, collect most money, and that was to test my propensity for risk behavior. And so the way these tools are usually calibrated is people who are currently in the role play the game, and maybe say you have an accountant firm, you wanna hire more accountants, you have your 50 accountants play those 12 games or whatever, how many games, and if they're all risk takers, then job seekers would be evaluated. They're also risk takers. If they're risk takers, they would be on the yes pile. This is, like, very generalizing it, right? There are a couple more criterias and a few more games. But that's sort of the ideas, the idea, and we've seen it as all the rage a few years back, all these games, because it felt like it appeals to people versus filling out personality tests, like, "Am I the life of the party? Yes, no," those 100 or whatever questions. It is much more entertaining to play these games. So one vendor actually, the former director of TA at Walmart who left told me, "Yeah, we got one of those games in an acquisition that Walmart did, and might as well test it." So they tested it and actually found out that it was negatively correlated with success at Walmart. So he's like, "Yeah, we didn't use that." And what what I found out, like some of the tests. So the problem with the accountants is like maybe they're all risk takers. So then you are looking for risk takers in job seekers, but is risk taking actually part of the job description or in the job analysis, right? Is it actually a skill you're supposed to use, or is it just the people you are sitting at those desks in your office, those are risk takers or for whatever reason, right? Could be, or I'm sort of pushing the argument here, but like a video tool might find out that people with brown hair are more successful because there are lots more people with brown hair. Should we hire people with brown hair? Obviously not. And what so there's a question of like these capabilities, and the way I've learned it is like that companies have like current employees test it, and then they do kind of a mapping the capabilities afterwards. They're like, okay, they're risk takers. So we think risk takers is maybe related to this skill in the job. And I was like, that's really not a job analysis. That's really not looking at like what are the skills and capabilities you need for the job. And they compare it to the general population, but one of the companies only looks at the people who are currently in the role who are successful, not the people unsuccessful. And first, I didn't think of it, but then I talked to an industrial organization psychologist who's like, they might want to rethink that because we did this. We were trying to hire nurses in for this medical conglomerate, and we tested them and found out that like compared to the general population, the nurses that are successful here in this medical center, they're more compassionate than the general population. It's exactly what these games do as well. Great. So anyone would think, well, find compassionate nurses, right? Like people are compassionate more than the general population with the nursing license, and you're good to go. You hire the successful people. And he's like, yeah. And then we looked at the nurses who weren't successful. What do they have in common compared to the general population? Well, it turns out they were also more compassionate. So it just seems like people who in this case, who worked in this healthcare setting were more compassionate than the general population. So that was actually not a criterion to find successful people. That was conscientiousness. But they wouldn't have found out if they didn't look at the unsuccessful people. But I think we see like kind of like these methodical errors again and again. I've seen like technical reports from game companies who've only tested it on college students between 20 and 27 or something. I'm like, what's with people? What's with older people? Has anyone tested it on them? Like, we know that this doesn't easily generalize. And while I was playing one of the games, I had to hit like the space bar as fast as possible. And I was like, what does it have to do? What kind of job is that like tests how much I hit the space bar? Like, I'm not and understanding it. So a lot of people, I think, who job seekers have the same kind of questions, but there is a question like how much is actually related to stuff that's in the job. And then when I asked somebody to play the game who's quadriplegic, Henry Claypool, like he was really worried, like what is with people who have a motor disability who can hit the space bar as fast as possible, right? What is with people who have a mental disability? We asked them to play these games. They have no idea what's in the game, so they can't easily ask for an accommodation because I have no idea how am I being tested. So it's difficult, and I do think that like we build these tools with like data from current employees. We already know that people with disabilities are underrepresented. So how can they be represented in the model? And especially with like disabilities can be so individually expressed. So maybe if somebody who's autistic in the training data, and then you have a job seeker who's also autistic taking the game, but really it could be so different how they express their disability that their data wouldn't actually correlate in the same way. So I really think that a lot of vendors haven't answered that question. What I hear again and again is like, well, they can ask for an accommodation. I'm like, well, they often don't want to because people with disabilities, I think rightly so, are afraid if they ask for an accommodation, they land on an imagined pile B that the hiring managers never look at, right? That pile of resumes of people that ask for an accommodation. Mm, but I think they it's difficult. So I don't know if this we really have squared that round, make it accessible to people and make sure that this is fair to everyone. And we also see that like a lot of companies test the results at the end for passing rates of people of different races and male and female, but they don't check for people with disabilities. Never heard anybody checking for age and other protected classes. So I do wonder, like, we really should also test for that, and we also should, like, go deeper outside of the uniform guidelines that ask for, like, from 1978 that ask for, like, race and gender, like, put this actually together because we've seen in one example where a researcher audited a one of the gaming companies and actually looked at Black females and found out that they had lower passing rates than other sectional people, and that didn't make it into the final audit. He told me while the audit was happening. And we don't look enough into that, and I think companies should do a whole lot more.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Oh my gosh, this is such interesting data. And let's talk now about the phone interviews and the video interviews.
Oh, yeah.
Right, because that was also in your book, and I thought that was a great well, a couple chapters, right? And it's funny because you mentioned a lot of the companies that you're talking to, interviewing for the book, and a couple of them, 'em I'm going, "Oh, I've worked with that company, I know that company." So, especially on the video interviews, you mentioned HireVue. So, I know that they've kind of been around for a long time doing video interviews. Now there's more.
Yeah, yeah, and they're one of the leaders, right? Like, I think in 2022, they said they did their 33 millionth interview. Not necessarily with AI, 'cause they have 2 products, right? They have one where you just answer the question, a human hiring manager watches it, and then they have a product where on top of that, they have an AI tool that analyzes job seekers.
But there's so many of them now that are coming out. I mean, a friend of mine that I know is coming up with a new software now that's going to have an AI interview tool, a video and
Yeah, and
audio.
and all my students know video interviews. Like, every time I think there's definitely a generational divide that we see this often used, like, uh, a lot of, like, high turnover jobs in, like, retail and fast food, and so a lot of students, they have, like, summer jobs and those kinds of jobs, and they all know video interviews, and they talk about it, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, we know all of this," and I found one job seeker who really liked the video interviews. I think almost everyone else was like, this is so weird that we have to do this. I'm like, you have to, like, be sort of excited about yourself talking into the little camera, no one is there. And a lot of job seekers also complain that they're like, I couldn't ask a question about the company. Like, they're asking me to do all of this, to jump through all of these hoops and take this assessment, video interview, and this game, blah, blah, blah. And I was never allowed to ask a question. I wanted to know. So I think companies might want to take note of that.
Well,
Um,
here's the thing though. So I did an interview with a bot, right? Her name was Sarah, and she called me on the phone, and it was a test drive. I was test driving some software for this one company. And I had actually a pretty good interview with her, and I knew she was a bot from the very beginning, and it was just to understand, what do they call it? The human factor pieces of it. So, I said afterwards, I told the team, I said, I had a great conversation with her. I said, "What I found interesting was when I asked her questions, because she asked me at the end, 'Do you have any questions?' And I did. I had about 5 questions for her on the culture of the company, on the position, the hiring team, the salary range for the position, compensation, any benefits." And so I kinda went into my whole list of questions. What she did was, "Oh, that's a very good question." And as you get farther into the interview process, somebody on the team will be able to go over that type of question or those answers with you. So she took the question, but then she deferred the question,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Or the
yeah,
answer, I
yeah.
should say, deferred the answer. So that was very interesting. But on the video interviews, when we first started doing video interviews using HireVue back in 2014 for one of my clients, or maybe it was 2015 we started using HireVue. A lot of negative feedback from people who were at the mid-career range and up. The executives didn't like it. Like you said, though, people who were what they called high volume hires, where you had a whole lot of the same position open, technicians or assemblers, or at the time, I think they were looking for people inside of these data centers to work routers and cablers and all that kind of stuff. So they had multiple positions. Those people didn't mind it as well because they knew there were a lot of positions and they understood that it was gonna help fast track. And I think that's up to us as recruiters if you're going to be on the front end telling candidates, "Hey, you're gonna be using this tool, but I'm here to explain to you what the tool is for. It's gonna help fast track the whole process." So then they see, okay, oh, there's a benefit to it. So if they go in understanding there's a benefit to using this tool, they might be a little more pro using it. But people who are at the executive level, they did not want to use that tool.
Yeah, and I think there could also be a secondary level here, right? That might show the power imbalance on this, that this is being used on folks who have often the least economic power, right? People who work in like hourly jobs and in retail, they often get paid like maybe a little bit more than minimum wage. Like those are often not the people who are empowered to say like I'm not doing this. Like I it's no. But like people who are like applying for CEO jobs or like upper management or even middle management, they're like I have choices. I'm not gonna do that. And I found that a lot of job seekers, especially in white collar jobs, were like, I refuse to do that. I'm not gonna apply to this company. I'm gonna stay at my job. Like I'll find another one. Obviously that fluctuates with like the times. I'm sure like at the beginning of the corona of COVID when so many people were laid off. I think a lot of CEOs who were laid off in leadership would have done a video interview to get a job, right? Like in one way, and not only Zoom as we were all doing during COVID, but when the times were better, they're like absolutely not. So I think it does show a little bit of that as well, that we use this often on people who have the least amount of power. And obviously, like some of the AI tools, I hope they will never be used on CEOs because you would have so little data on these jobs, right? Like that cannot generalize. So I think some of these tools hopefully will never be used, at least the AI capability. But yeah, so when I first reported on this was very early on 2017. I heard about it 2018. I specifically did this larger a piece for the Wall Street Journal, and we went to HireView's headquarters. They invited us. We tried the tool and talked to their IO psychologist and really got a deep dive into the tool. And I independently fact checked things and reached out to psychologists and was like, they use this like emotion recognition software that like checks what are my facial expressions when I answer this question, compares it to people who have been successful and not successful in their video interviews. Like maybe at the same answer of like strength and weaknesses, if I smile, they smile. It's very generalizing it, but then I'm predicted to be successful because the successful people smiled, and it also looked at the intonation of my voice and the words that I use. And when I talk to scientists about it, they're like, "There's no science of facial expressions in job interviews that predict how successful you're going to be in the job." And I was like, "Oh, interesting." There's also no consensus in science about what the computer companies that are selling this kind of technology say, that like a smile means everyone's happy. And of course, everyone, I mean, I've been in so many job interviews where I've smiled. So a computer would like see the smile and be like, she's happy, but I'm zero happy. In fact, I'm like, yeah, I'm super nervous. And I'm sure everyone has like kind of examples about that. So that also doesn't necessarily apply. Also, like where you're from, what culture, like cultural differences matter in facial expressions and emotions. So I was like, oh, so that doesn't seem to be really based on anything. It's just measuring people's facial expressions because we can, but there is actually no meaning that we know of behind it. So I think there's real questions like, what are we using these technologies for? Like, just because we can, should we? And to be honest, like, you can so easily move into like really difficult territory, right? Like, what if you had like hired more women over time and they have different facial expressions than men? Or many men, many women. I mean, you could really do a tremendous amount of damage. And I think also, like, I thought companies want people who are like well qualified and the qualifications based on anything, but like facial expression have nothing to do with that. So I think we fall, not always, but like a lot with AI, we fall into this like sort of trap where we think like everything that we leave behind in the world means something, is meaningful about that person, right? Like our facial expressions, the intonation of my voice, even though there's no meaning to it. And I think we've seen this again and again in hiring where like I think until a few decades ago in France, it was like a big they always asked people for graphology tests. They had like C-suite leaders write like stuff with their handwriting and they compared it to job seekers' handwriting. Yes, it was, and no one ever found any evidence that this actually works and that this is actually how you find people's personalities. But my handwriting is unique. So maybe myself is in there. So it feels plausible, right? Sort of like what other companies that I've looked into have said that like in your Twitter feed, in your LinkedIn profile, like this is like because you voted and there's something about you in there. So we can look deeper and find like your personality traits in there. We can find who you really are. And when we tested the tools, that's not true. Like when I tested on myself, an expert, we kind of had like opposite personalities on Twitter, on LinkedIn by the same tool. I was like, wow, like either I have multiple personalities or this is obviously not working. And if it's not working, we really shouldn't be using it to hire people. This is like not a good idea. So I think we see this again. And I think it has the same underlying idea, right? Like in my Twitter feed, because I wrote those tweets, something about me is in there. And that can be pulled out by AI that humans may not be able to do. And so far we have seen no evidence. Like we tested it in a larger study. I worked with a computer scientist and a sociologist. Did a little bit between myself and expert. That is not a huge sample size. We could have just been outliers. But yeah, we saw this again. Also, like, for example, you loaded the same resume as a PDF or as a different format. Um, so that really strikes me as like, this could be really problematic. And then I looked at another interview tool that was going to check that was marketed to companies mostly in the West. For hiring contact center employees, usually in the global south. And the idea was like this tool can check how well you speak English. So I was like, whoa, that's interesting. Well, let's test it out. So I tested it out. I spoke to it in English and answered all the questions about obstacles I've overcome in a team and with my boss. And I got an 8.5 out of 9 English proficiency. That was the score. And I was a little proud. I was like, "Look at me, like, English is my second language and cool." And then I thought, like, what is with people because what the tool does, it doesn't actually, like, "listen," quote, unquote, to the recording, it does a transcript, right? It, like, converts your audio into text, and then it refers on the text. So, I was like, "Well, these AI tools that we use for transcription, how well do they work on people with accents, people who have a speech disabilities? Are they being fairly treated?" And that question came up again and again, and no one has done any real testing on this. So I was like, okay, well, I don't have a speech disability, so I'm not going to pretend I have one. So I was like, let me just speak to it in German and see what happens. And companies have told me that, like, well, if somebody has speech disability or there's a problem, you have to hit a certain threshold. And if you don't hit that threshold, the AI tool will route you to a human. So there will be like sort of an error message, and a human will get in touch and probably do an interview with you. So I was, like, prepared for this error message to come, and, so I spoke to it in German. I had a lot of fun reading the Wikipedia page on psychometrics, psychometry in German, and, I send it out. I thought I'd get an error message. I get a 6 out of 9 English proficient back, and I was like, "Whoa, I didn't even say a word in German." Sorry, I didn't even say a word in English, and now I'm proficient in English. Wow, unbelievable. So we did the same thing with, like, I had a graduate student who spoke Mandarin, another one Vietnamese. We did the same test. We got always similar results. And another tool that did the same thing, we actually got a transcript. And tool generated a transcript, and it was total gibberish, and I was still 73% qualified for the role, even though, I mean, what I said in English, in this English transcript, trying to make sounds, making sense of, like, the German sounds make no sense. I still was, like, highly qualified. So, I mean, I think that worries me, like, if tools like that we make these high stakes decision, who gets rejected and who gets hired based on these tools, and they really don't work, and they fall apart so easily on these, like, little tests that I do, even though I don't even code. Like, I'm not doing, like, kinda large scale studies, taking the algorithm apart. That does worry me if we know so little and the developers know so little about their own tools and they break apart like that.
Wow, that's amazing. So, when I was first working with well, even now, when you're working with some of the tools that are out there, like LinkedIn, for example, it'll say if you put in a Boolean search and it'll pull up all of the candidates that it thinks that it matches. Maybe 10% match, maybe 20 on a good day. I mean, and even if you put in quite a few well, they always say the more Boolean terms you put in, the smaller your candidate pool, which is true. But again, how do we know, and even going back to what you're talking about, how do you know, even if somebody doesn't have something in their profile, their resume, that they're not qualified to do it?
Yeah.
We just don't
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
right?
And I think, we've seen a lot of tools that are quite basic here that and trained on context that might know like Photoshop. Okay, do you have Photoshop on your resume? But if you put in like Adobe Creative Suite, like, every recruiter would know that that entails Photoshop and that this candidate likely knows Photoshop if they put that on their resume, right? But we've seen this again and again with, like, so-called AI tools that they don't understand that, and I think that is really to the detriment of a lot of applicants, right? Like, you have to really put, like, a list of skills and how the different wording and I think that's kind of not fair. We need to really build better tools. And I think we do have the technology for that to have like different synonyms or different ways to describe some of these skills.
Okay, so that leads me then to my next question. When I was at, I think it was Unleash, I had asked all of the people, because I interviewed a number of people there, I asked them all the same questions. And one of the questions I asked was, look into your crystal ball and tell me what you think, what you see for AI down the road. And these are people, of course, who they're sampling tons of tools, right? They're evaluating tons of new software. The
Yeah,
hard
tell
saying
me
I
what
got.
they said. Like what are they seeing in their crystal balls?
So there was a lot of parallel responses, honestly. They see that the tools are not going to have the human ingenuity, creativity, decision-making skills, that it's gonna be that the AI tools are basically gonna be helping to minimize what we have to do that's repetitive tasks. And there are a lot of repetitive tasks. Creating job descriptions, creating, like you were talking about earlier with the performance analytics tools, creating those kind of tools to help decipher some of the high performers versus non-performers type of thing. Of course, there's like you were saying, a lot to be worked on there. So one guy had mentioned that there are 5 pathways to right now utilizing AI, and another woman, I brought it up to her, and she said, "No, I don't agree that there's 5 pathways." She goes, "I see 3 big outcomes: discovery, finding candidates for current needs; productivity, finding candidates for more efficiency," and they did talk about the efficiency, helping us to be more efficient. And then she said, "AI is a table stakes requirement for vendors now." She said, "Because it's giving us insight, reducing risk." So it's important to leverage AI intelligence insight for job descriptions, content, interview scorecards, and redundant tasks. But leveraging AI to move faster and smarter is a safe use of AI versus deciding on hires. People still need to be incorporated into the offer stages, the hiring, who's going to make the decisions on hiring, and not AI. You cannot use AI to make decisions on who to hire, how to compensate them, and a lot of those type of things. So they're basically saying anything that's kind of data driven, redundancy tasks, but anything that's related to really high stakes decisions, who to hire, how much to pay them, and maybe what some of their capabilities are to what you're saying. That's kind of what we're hearing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I hope like that's still for job description, and I think that's already happening, and I think that's already like a critical point that often for job descriptions, I don't actually think a lot about what is job seeker really needs. We look at the old job description from like 3 years ago, and be like, okay, all of that, and now we're gonna add two more things because we now use this computer program or this thing, and we think this should be a little bit more strategic. So we have this like laundry list of all these things that people need. And the reality is they probably don't need all of that because we really haven't thought about this. So like using AI about that, I'm not quite sure to do that because I think then that's how you reject qualified candidates because then the tool looks at like 20 things that everyone has to have, right? And there's only so many people, and maybe they're mediocre at all of those 20 things, and then everyone is like up in arms that we don't have enough qualified candidates. La 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 la. And I think sometimes looking into the tools and what they're actually looking at and thinking about, like, what are the real relevant skills that we need to look for versus all of the beautiful must haves that we, of course, all want, but probably there are not that many unicorns out there that have them all. And then I get it's difficult and it's really difficult, obviously. And there's certain limitations with resumes that are never going to go away, right? Like somebody put in that they're a software developer and they know this software language. I mean, I don't know. They put that on there, right? Like, do I know if they're like beginner level or senior level, or are they really good at this? Maybe they've been in a sales position for 20 years, but they're bad at sales. Who knows? I mean, we will never get beyond that. So we have to look at those limitations.
Yeah, and I've always said that job descriptions are kind of a wish list. I mean, yeah, you've got your basic qualifications that you ought to put in there, education requirements if you need it, how many years experience you're looking for a particular role, some basic skills that you might need. But I have time and time again mentioned to clients and hiring managers, okay, do you realize that you've got the words must have written 37 times on this job description? I mean, and just some of the redundancies.
The difference is like a human, you would look at these, be like, and look at the resumes, be like, you know what? They really need those skills. And 37 is unrealistic. I'm just gonna find the most people that like have the most important skills. But like in AI, if you program it that way, we'll look for all 37. If you don't have one, you are out, you get rejected, right? So I think those are kind of or you rank lower, but that basically is a rejection, right? If you like are 998 out of 1,000 candidates, the likelihood the recruiter is gonna call you is like very slim to none. So you're basically getting rejected. And I think that's sort of the problem, right? Like an AI tool doesn't have consciousness or something, can sort of make those connections. Or what I've also found out in Joe Fuller's report was that actually like almost 50% of the AI tools went in this survey that were used by C-suite leadership, that if the candidates had a longer than 6 month job gap, they were automatically rejected. So you can be the most qualified person, you were out if the tool detects that you had a job gap. So, like, a human might see, oh, somebody moved from like Honolulu to North Carolina. So maybe they're military spouse and maybe it took forever. So this it maybe explains this. I'm going to give them a chance. Or you would assume, like, maybe they were on parental leave. Who knows? They have all the qualifications. Of course, I'm going to call them in. An actual doesn't think like a human. It just is like, out, yes or no. You don't get a second chance. And I think that's sort of different here. So we have to be a little bit more actually thoughtful maybe with our job descriptions versus just reusing the ones that we have.
I've been using Gemini to write job descriptions, and what I like about it is it gives you 3 drafts, and then you can pick which one you like, but what I've done is I'll just cut and paste what I like from the Gemini job description and pop it in. I still create my own. I'm still gonna create
Yeah. Yeah.
what I know my client needs for that role based on what they've told me, plus I'll use what I like from Gemini or ChatGPT, whatever, and plug them in and still create my own. So there it is. I'm using my creativity in conjunction with what AI has done for me, right?
Yeah. And I use AI all the time. I think sometimes though, like what I think people should not be doing is like use ChatGPT or another large language model and just pop in the job description and all of the resumes and tell me like, hey, tell me which is the best candidate. ChatGPT wasn't built for that. It's built to come up with convincing text. It doesn't know what like who is more qualified. I also always wonder about like confidentiality. I was like, people have their like phone numbers on there, their names, their like addresses. Like, you're gonna give this to like large tech companies? They're gonna use this for the training data? And like, I mean, that was one of the things that when I tested some of these video interviews tool too. I mean, this is like a couple years ago, so it wasn't so easy to create deep fakes yet. But I wasn't in front of it. I was next to it, so there's no one in front of the camera. And I would type. I had pre-built a deep fake of my voice, and I was, like, putting words in that my deep fake would say, and no one detected it. I got a score actually slightly better than my normal score, I think because my deep fake had less of an accent. So it beat me, but I was, like, kind of baffled that there was not even basic security built in to check if there's a human in front of it, like, right? And, like, now we have the multiplication that for a lot of, like, video interviews, now people like just put the question into ChatGPT, read the answers, and companies are aware of this, that this is happening. So I think we need to actually do a whole lot more assessments and hiring things and like really think through like how can we get to the candidate, and maybe automation isn't serving us in the best way. So at least we need to like upbuild this kind of automation.
So what do you think that AI needs to what do you think we need AI to do for us?
Oh, it should do like all our emails. It can autocorrect our text. Like it's great. It can like write technical reports, like all kinds of stuff. Like it's a really transformative technology in many ways. But I think if it's used for like high risk, which I would say, which is like in the criminal justice system, how long people should be sentenced to jail if you get a loan. But I think hiring is also high risk because it matters if I have a job, right? And like it matters if I can provide for my family. And a lot of us also have a lot of happiness and fulfillment in their jobs. So we all strive to have at least somewhat fulfilling jobs for most people. So if I apply and I'm not the most qualified candidate, I'd be upset. But if I find out that I was rejected because I had the word softball on my resume, I would be absolutely livid. That's not fair. It's hard to find them because a lot of job seekers don't even when I know AI has been used on them, they didn't know. And obviously in hiring, you get rejected, I mean, so many times. It's part of applying to jobs, right? That they wouldn't even know. But yeah, some of them like asked for some of the data and started looking and questioned it and found problems along the way. So like, and it does, I mean, a lot of people who send out hundreds of applications, it is a very isolating, often depressing way. You never hear back, or maybe you get one interview. And like it is really hard to be a job seeker. And it's really hard to be a job seeker today. And so you can really tell how it like played with their mental health. And I was even like, when I talked to Sophie, who's like an African American woman who's a coder, has like a bachelor's degree and a graduate degree in information science, has taught girls how to code, has like a project side. She's a veteran, and how she couldn't find a job. It took her 146 applications. She had like a spreadsheet of that where I thought like, wow, I thought this woman would get like so many offers because she fulfills all the boxes and tech companies that would absolutely want her. But it's kind of interesting. So we tried some things, tested some things, and learned a lot about her. And she was successful because she sort of circumvented the process. She actually then, when she found a recruiter, she would apply for the job and then send their application through like a LinkedIn message or something. And then she heard back from them through those messages and got a job interview scheduled and gotten a job offer. So yeah, we see this again and again, and it does affect people. So I do think we have to get it right. So this is not like the same with AI in healthcare. Like I think all of us, if AI makes a decision on my healthcare medication, we want it to be right. We don't want it to be wrong. And the same with hiring. This is a high risk place, and like sort of who we are as a society, if we are like fair, will be measured in that. And right now, I'm not seeing that. And I think the technology a lot obfuscates a lot of problems because it looks like objective and the tool ranks people. And it's even hard, I think, for folks who work in TA or hiring managers to like even see if something is wrong because the tool keeps ranking people, right? Like, and it looks like, and they get these like great scores, like 80.72%. Sounds very mathematical. And it's like, well, what is that based on? Like, and it used to be that in some of the hiring software, like facial expressions were analyzed. So maybe you got a great score, but it doesn't mean anything. So we have to be a whole lot more skeptical, a whole lot more pushing into it. And I think as a society we have evolved, right? That we see that now too, that like there are these problems in AI applications, and we need to work on that collectively, all of us, to make it just a little bit better.
And also too, to your point, not necessarily trust the outcome of these searches, right? I mean, when you have and I think that people just kind of fall into this trap of, "Oh, this is what the system says, so the system must be right." They're not questioning what's going on the back end, or that there could be potential biases, or that AI has just completely gotten it wrong. So my next question for you, Hilke, is how do we utilize then AI tools that we control? versus having the tool control us.
I mean, I think we just like are very thoughtful in testing it. Like we need to open the black box and sort of understand like what is it infer upon? Like are there any problematic proxies here? Like kind of like that maybe in resume screeners. And can we get them out or should we then or if we cannot, maybe we shouldn't use the technology. Maybe it's just not usable in that use case. Okay, well, let's find something else. Like other way. So I think what happened, I'm generalizing it, but maybe in the first generation of AI tools that we built for AI for hiring, we sort of automated a lot of maybe somewhat flawed processes and gave it to the machine because it sucks to do it as a human. And I'm not sure if we're all the wiser with it and built like I think we built some of the problems right into the next generation of the tools. And I think that's problematic. So let's be more creative. Let's find ways to like evaluate people differently. I think this also like maybe should help us like to think through like how should we hire? Like what are the criteria? Is it like only skills, personality? If you only hire for personality, oh, that worries me because personality is like about 10% or so predictive on a good day about your how good you will be on a job. So it's like 90% or even more that's not predictive. And personality is like sort of a stagnative idea. Like, I'm actually kind of a shy person. I think I've kind of overcome that by pushing myself to like approach people, random people, at, like functions on the street and chat with them. And at first, I had like really sweaty hands. I don't have that anymore. But like a personality test would probably still find that, right? But it doesn't account that we as people can evolve and like change and adapt. And so I think we need to do a whole lot better. Like, can we do maybe better assessments? Sometimes I also feel, can we build like a nonprofit for assessments so that like people, job seekers don't have to do the same assessment 50,000 times. That there's like a coding assessment, it's like on the blockchain and companies can just tap in and see like, okay, this person has done this certification and we all understand what this means and sort of have standards there. But I do feel that it can't be run by a private company. It has to be like a non-for-profit or like a public one so that we can sort of understand, well, what does it say about Hilke? And maybe I got it wrong, so I can appeal, right? Kind of like a FICO score where you have a right to see the score and you can appeal. And I'm sure the appeal process is painful, but you can, which is now different, right? Like we have no idea how companies score us, what's in the scoring. And the companies themselves often don't know. So I think we need to know a lot more there.
Oh, yeah, I agree. It's interesting because we kinda did that with companies when they created Glassdoor, where you could go in and rate a company that like what you talk about. Now we need to kinda do the same thing, but for people.
Yeah, and assessments, and I would love to work with companies out there, like, I would love to know, like, can we do, like, longitudinal studies to, like, test AI tools, test human hiring, and, like, really understand if the AI tool labeled me and you hired me, was I really not a successful employee 3 years down the road? And that's not only obviously, you can't do this with one person, right? You have to hire a lots and lots of people to really understand this, but I think that would actually be something that would be like a benefit to humanity to sort of find this out. And I would love to do this, not as a journalist, but as a researcher, and build a larger team. Like I think that would be really helpful. But I haven't seen that because it's obviously a lot of work that I think most people in TA and in HR don't have time for that. I get it, but we
Yet.
kind of need.
But yet, because as AI evolves, the need for this is gonna become greater and greater, and it's gonna start g what you're talking about is gonna get pushed to the front. Right now, everyone's still trying to grapple with, "What do I buy? What do I use? What's my neighbor using? What's my competitor using that might be giving them an advantage?" They're not even thinking about all this testing that you're talking about, long-term testing, right? But then once things start settling in, then that's gonna be the time to say, "Hey, how well did you guys test all this?" Right?
Yeah. I wanna be around for that because I think it is crucial to do this for the sake of all of us.
Yeah. And a couple other things that and we can talk about it some other time, but a couple other things too that I just wanna mention that you brought up in your book. One of the points that I found very interesting was around some of the programs that companies are developing for their employees and some of the healthcare programs and how there's some biases around that as well. I brought it up to some people that when I was talking about your book, I said, "Her book encompasses a lot of information, including healthcare programs or wellness programs and how there is AI bias even around that." And I said, if you wanna dive into, I mean, a really good segment, I mean, you uncovered a lot about that.
I think I'm gonna push more into that because I think we're gonna see a lot more of that, right? Because we now have AI that like sort of says it can look at our data, like even our voices, and sort of understand, are we depressed or anxious, for example? And you don't even need my consent to do this, right? So I can totally see this moving into like the workplace of employers trying to help their folks. But I think there's always a double-edged sword that like we've also seen this with companies that like they build something that is beneficial, but when it comes to the time comes to layoffs or something, they might look at this kind of data too and be like, well, we know that people who are depressed might be underperforming, so maybe we look at that data for that, right? And that's first of all, it's not it's not taken for that, and it's wrong to do this, but, I mean, like, there's all kinds of things that we're seeing moving into the space of work that is, like, connected to wellness, and one company that gave me a demo was like, "Look at Aiden, like, we giving, like, him a personalized recommendation to see a therapist, and here are all, like, his, like, in-network benefits," and I was like, "How do you Aiden needs to see a therapist?" And they're like, "Well, he dropped a spouse from his medical plan, so we think he's going through a divorce," and I was like, how do you know that? They're like, "Well, we have benefits of millions of Americans that we," and those are signals that come from the benefits, right? They also said, like, Aiden might also need a financial advisor, so we sent him, like, a message about that. I was like, "Why do you think he needs a financial advisor?" He's like, "Well, he took 2 loans out of his 401k, so that's a signal for an AI, right?" Like, and then they talked about Maya, who had, like, back surgery, and now she needs PT, and the tool was gonna nudge her, and I was like, "How do you let Maya needs PT and had neck surgery?" They're like, "We have access to health claims data." So I think there's gonna be a whole lot of, like, beneficial software that might also be at the same time very creepy, right? That, like, we all have a bad day, and it's fine to talk about it. Here's, like, your therapist. They're not gonna say, based on, like, our creepy AI, "We uncovered this about you, and you should do that," right? It's like a nudge and like a message that I don't think most employers would know where this data is coming from. So I think there's a whole lot more that's gonna happen, right? In this nexus of, like, wellness, health, work, where employers wanna be helpful, but also might fall into sort of like a more creepy way, and I think we're gonna predict a whole lot more about our health and who we are and where we're going, so I think there's a whole lot to look at. This was just the first layer.
Oh my gosh, and kind of a final question here. You mentioned that we need to start now with respect to protecting our human rights and ingenuity and creativity and whatnot. And I like what you suggested about kinda creating this nonprofit organization to kinda delve deeper into this whole entire subject. But what would you say is that the one thing that we need to do to start to protect our rights there?
I mean, I think we all need to be more skeptical, right? Like really, really don't trust the marketing claims of company, which we often don't, right? In other ways of our lives, right? Like every company is gonna tell me this is like the best shoe they've ever built, and I fully believe that, right? Like we're very this is not the best coffee or whatever. Like we are very skeptical consumers in many other ways, and we really need to start to do that with AI. And we need to demand to build better tools. And maybe some of us need to build better tools in the public interest, right? Like maybe the problem is that like, especially in hiring, it feels like there are a lot of venture-backed startups, and they're supposed to put the product out pretty quickly and pay investors back, and there isn't a whole lot of time to think through, like, "Is this the right thing? Is the science there?" Right? So I think maybe we need to push the public sector a little bit to build tools in the public interest, put them in the public domain, that this maybe push some companies to use the tools that we know work versus the ones that don't or that we are not sure of. And if we're not sure of, we should be really skeptical about the claims and really need to test it. So I want to push more into that and also like have a larger conversation. Like, are some of these use cases actually a good idea for us to use? And I think there was sort of a conversation in, for example, in the European Union because they have decided they're going to outlaw the emotion recognition in video interviews in general in the EU AI Act. It's very clearly stated, this is a technology we do not endorse in any way and will not be allowed in the European Union. And they have like classified hiring as high risk, so there's more guardrails and regulations around that. So I think those, I mean, I think that would be good if we had as a society a larger discussion here. What do we want? What do we not want? And not leave it to tech companies to shape this world. Like we all get to shape this world. Doesn't feel like that, but I think we do.
I love that. We all get to shape this world. Stay skeptical. We all get to still, yeah, use our own human creativity and ingenuity to help shape this world. I love that. What are the top 3 things you learned when writing this book?
That writing a book is more enjoyable than you think. I thought it'd be like a lonely, sad process, and it was a great process. I met so many people, I talked to so many people, I had so much fun writing it, structuring it, and, like, thinking through it. I don't know why I thought it was, like, a lonely, sad process to write a book. It also, like, was the hardest thing and the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. I think I was surprised how much I connected to people who read the book and sent me messages from all over the world. I was, like, blown away. The the way people, like, interacted with the book, because I've done films and podcasts before and have gotten responses from people, but I feel like with the book, people really take the time to think about it, to sit with it, and I think podcasts and other media may be a little bit more fleeting, and I was like, "Wow, this is, like, very impactful and very, very meaningful to me," and that really did surprise me about writing the book. Um, I think those are the 2 things. The 3rd thing is, like, I think I'm gonna write another book.
I was gonna ask you that. Are you gonna write another book? Yeah. Well, I'm on your preferred, or I should say you're on my preferred reading list. So,
Thank you.
yeah, you're one of my preferred authors right now. Oh, no, I loved it. I have the audiobook, I have the hard copy, uh, and I think too, we need to read this book. It's called The Algorithm by Hilke Schellmann, and it's amazing. You can get it on Amazon. It's
Like, updating the UK version now, like, with, like generative AI was already out there, so it is in there, but I wanna keep tabs on, like, some new developments, but what's kinda interesting, everyone asked me that, they're like, "Oh, it's gonna be outdated when it comes on." I was like, "Not really." Like, a lot of this technology has been around for a while in hiring and in the workplace, like, they're, like, new iterations a little bit, but the same technology has been around for a while, so it doesn't change as much as we think. We have these, like, jumps in, like, generative AI that I think we as a public have, like, really seen and lived through, but, like, some other AI, like this predictive AI that's mostly prevalent in hiring, that hasn't changed that much.
no. No, and the people who really need to read this book are the people who are thinking about creating software, AI software.
Yes, and I've spoken to some of them, so I think there is, like I hope there is an opening to really think through, "What am I doing here? And just because I can, should I?" It's a good question to always ask yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Helga,
Um,
thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation, and I have been so excited to speak with you, and I'm a huge fan. So thank
oh, thank
you.
you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted and thank you for asking me all these questions and having this, like, really amazing conversation.